Okay, right. So good to meet you. Well, I say good to meet you, Shawnae. I've known you for a number of years, basically. So we're not meeting for the first time, obviously. But I just wanted to put you on the stage because we've had a number of people, subscribers and viewers, because not all viewers are subscribers, who asked me to do a video on Odinism. Instead of me just doing it piece to camera myself, I thought I'd bring somebody, onto the show basically who's been involved in Odinism and paganism generally for quite a long time. And of course, it helps subscribers, viewers to get a much broader view of it when they see both a man and a woman talking about it. So tell us a bit about yourself, Shawnae. Where are you from?
I'm from a place in Minnesota called the Iron Range.
Right. Okay. And were you born in Minnesota?
Yes, I was in
Okay.
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis. Right. Of course. Well, that's a very famous name. Everybody here will know of Minneapolis. So
Uh-huh.
at what time in your life did you actually get attracted to Odinism or paganism in general? Can you explain that for the benefit of the
I
viewers, please?
can say that I've been interested in learning about all kinds of paganism since I was a little kid. You
Right.
know, I enjoyed learning about all the gods and goddesses from Greek, Roman, Egyptian, all of those things. It just fascinated me when I grew up. Like as I was growing up, I even I got my first tattoo. Well, I
Yeah.
can't even really show you, but it's a Celtic knot around a
Yeah.
how do you pronounce it? A
Triskelion.
Triskelion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Triskelion. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a dream about that. It came to me in a dream one night, and that I was like, I spoke to this woman, and she told me something about it. I can't remember. It was such a long time ago, but I ended up getting the tattoo on my arm because
Wow.
the dream just felt so powerful.
Yeah.
Um, I think when I came into Odinism, for the first time, I had actually met a man that taught me a little bit about it, and he gave me Ron McVan's Temple of Woden.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
He gave me that, and I read the book, and I thought it there were a lot of things in there that I thought were great. And at that point in my life, uh, it wasn't the right time to pick those things up because I found myself uh, poisoning my own well with drugs and alcohol and things like that.
Yeah.
So I kind of had to put it back down for a little while. I
Yeah.
I went head on back into Christianity and Jesus worship and all of that and whatnot. And I was sitting there doing a Celebrate Recovery meeting. I was
Yeah.
in sobriety and I was leading the Celebrate Recovery meeting. And I had already gotten a tattoo, like my 1 year clean tattoo, and there's a Vulcanite on my arm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this man walked into the church, and like the first thing that I seen was a Vulcanite in relatively the same spot on his arm. And I looked at him and I was like, honestly, what the hell am I doing here? Like, this is not something that, I identify with anymore. All of these, bleeding heart Christians and whatnot. And
Yeah.
I quit and I didn't go back.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot more things involved in it that I was seeing going on in my church for a long time that I didn't like.
Yeah.
That night, particularly, there happened to be a pedophile that had come in, and I was upset about
Yeah.
it.
Of
Like, you're
course.
allowing this person to be around our children?
Yeah.
Like, took all the kids and I brought them in the Sunday school room, and I'm like, you don't deserve fucking forgiveness. You deserve a bullet.
Uh, yeah.
And that was a part of the things that just like I seen that Vulcanite And then that incident happened, and I was just like, enough. That's it.
Yeah.
I'm done. And not much long after that, my old friend Charlie and a few other people that I know that are close to me started a kindred up here. We called it the Iron Blood Kindred.
Yeah.
And that's kind of just how it started, you know. I had been toying with the idea for the of the AFA for a little bit, because of my friend, well, now significant other, Brian Wilton, was in it, and I had enjoyed his books. One of his books was actually part of the reason why I switched everything around, because it just made sense to me. It was called Eager's Feast.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking a different way. You know, and he thought that I should join the AFA, and my kindred at one point wanted to join the AFA, and I was like, no, it looks like the Catholic Church of paganism.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to do that. And then after a little bit, you know, meeting more pagans along the way, and a majority of them were in the AFA, I'm like, okay, maybe I can give this a try. You know, and we went to a
Yeah.
couple of moots and a couple of different rituals that were amazing, honestly, amazing. Standing there around the fire during ritual, and my son's getting to put his hand on the horn and the sword, and it was just, he stood taller. You know what I mean? And those things kind of, and my little girl, my teeny little girl, she's standing there in
Yeah.
the circle with everybody, and it made me feel good. Something about it made me feel more than anything I had felt in church, other than, you know, in church it's all about guilt and shame and repentance and
Yeah.
this and that.
That's right.
I didn't feel that in the power of those circles and those blows. I really didn't.
Yeah, you see, this is the thing that I try to explain to Christians frequently, because they say, "You don't believe in sin? What moral code do you have?" Because they have this mistaken belief that Christianity is about a moral code. Well, I struggle to find where that moral code is. And
Oh,
as for sin, it's a control mechanism, and so we don't have sin or sinful worship at all in Odinism, and so you'll be judged by your actions, certainly, without a doubt, both by your peers and by the gods and the ancestors. And somebody telling you that to think this, to do that is sinful and it's wrong, etc., and this book forbids it, and that book forbids it. We don't have any of that, and so we don't believe in sin. As you know, it's a matter of honor. And so Christians say,
well,
but isn't that sin? No,
exactly.
it's not. No, honor is something totally different than sin. Honor is an uplifting, strengthening factor. Sin is designed to beat you down and control you and make
Push
you
you into
subservient.
submission.
Absolutely. And so in the AFA, you know, you felt good. Your children seemed to be happy. And so how long did you stay in the AFA?
That time I stayed in the AFA for close to a year. I flew out to California and I went to Odenshof, and um it was a good experience for the most part. I mean, to be honest, there are a lot of good people in the AFA.
Yeah.
Um, kind. I mean, who flies across the country by
Mm.
themselves? You know,
Mm.
to a group of people. Who knows? You know, they could have sacrificed me or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
But it
Absolutely.
wasn't like, they were really kind. People picked me up from the airport. The people hung out with me after the fact when they were going to drop me back off at the airport. Like, the hospitality was, you know, next to none I'd experienced in that kind of situation, like setting.
Yeah.
Um, but when I left the first time, there had been whispers about some of the higher ups, like Gothar and whatnot, were
Well, Shawnae,
entertaining
to be clear,
17-year-old children, cheating on their wives and this and that. And that wasn't something that
no,
I'm like,
no,
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 you're people that are in power, that are supposed to be, our priests or whatever you want to call them. Uh that's an abuse of power to
no, I
me.
agree. But
That is
we're
not
also,
acting
yeah,
honorably. That's not in that's has nothing to do with integrity or anything like that. It like
yeah,
lesson. And trust me, I know people are people and they're going to do what they're going to do, but when you're openly like bringing a 17-year-old girl to a bloat weekend and you're married and like or
yeah,
or when I left the second time, there had been a member that was in the AFA. At one point in time, he had gone to prison, and I think it was something along the lines of he slept with a 14-year-old girl.
goodness. Was
And
this in the
yeah, and there were people who knew about it and uh, called people out on it, and it didn't finally blow up until the second time that I had left last year, almost 2 years ago, actually, I
yeah?
think.
I mean,
And
there's an awful lot of that happening in the Christian church with the priesthood, and to see
yeah,
it, I mean, I've never been in the AFA. In fact, I've never been in any Odinist group here, other than the two ones that I formed myself, the Rites of Irminsul and now the Odinist Order. You're an administrator in the Odinist Order, so you know all about it. And you were in the previous iteration of it on VK.com. And
yeah,
so, and one of the reasons why is because very similar. I think it's a symptom of modern society in general, this degeneracy. And some of the groups I worked with in Nottingham, we must be careful not to name anyone for legal reasons and also the YouTube algorithm.
yeah,
But I found there uh, some very similar, not the same as what you're talking about, but, just, I could have put it, it's like being in the 1960s hippie commune,
yeah.
free
And they're
love.
swapping partners and this and that, and it's like some of the Gothias were like stealing people's women and this and that, and I'm like, why? Why are you so trashy? Like, that's just
Yeah,
terrible. That's disgusting. That's not something I see as uh, displaying good leadership.
exactly.
That's
Exactly.
abuse of your power, and like people who do that, I feel like are just what's that called? Did an episode on it with my podcast group. Uh, Parasocial relationships, like
Yeah,
cult leaders.
yeah,
Like
absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
kind of culty.
Yeah, they're almost like the messianic complex in Christianity. They set them up as these like David Koresh type figures. You know,
Oh,
and so when you later
yeah.
see them burning at a Waco, irrespective of all the rights and wrongs of what happened at Waco in the actual incident, you're not surprised because these people were always fruitcakes and bound to burn like a fruitcake that had been overcooked in the oven. And I've met quite a few people like that here, but the one thing I've found here is over the years, people have all these ridiculous notions about paganism, about wild orgies, etc., and sacrifice and all this other hilarious business. Well, I've never seen an orgy in any aspect of my life. I've never actually seen any animal sacrifices of any description. If I make it a blood offering, it's my own blood, because I don't feel the need to. See, the way I view it is this. I know it's different for everyone else, but if I'm doing a ritual and I want to make it particularly potent and to mean something, and it needs a blood sacrifice, and it will be my own blood that I shed, not the
Yeah.
blood of something else. And I remember years ago, it was quite an amusing tale. I was seeing this woman, and she was a psychiatric nurse, I won't name her, but she was actually more messed up than her patients, quite frankly. And I told her so.
They usually are.
Yeah, it was basically the job itself that had messed her up. But she was talking about these blood sacrifices, etc. And she was a pagan. I said, but the thing is, you drink carrot juice, don't you? And she says, yeah, I love it. I said, well, that's the blood of a carrot. I said, so every time you have carrot juice, yeah, I said, you're making a carrot juice blood sacrifice. She said, oh, don't say that. That's terrible. And I'm like, these are some of the people that you get, the wishy-washy lefty liberal types, basically. And but ultimately, I think here, with the vast majority of Odinists who tend to be very right-wing and conservative, they tend to live a very, how can I put it, structured lifestyle, and as much as possible try to be as noble and decent as they can. Nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes and we all do things that are wrong, because that's just part and parcel of being mortal, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think some of these pagan groups are utterly atrocious, quite frankly, because they're infected with wokeism. And you've got it in the States with the ancestry community, TAC, and we've got it here with ancestry UK, which is, I mean, they're into the old transgender Viking business and all the rainbow flags. And remember, we had that discussion about the guy in York recently who's turned his shop into a rainbow flag.
Yeah.
The right-hand side of the window anyway, and tells his customers that the runes had no significance whatsoever for the Germanic peoples, other than sending a note down to the pub, a woman, to tell her husband to come home for his dinner. I mean, where did they get the writing paper from, for a start? I mean, the guy's an absolute moron, and these are the people, and I know because I met quite a few. I won't name him. I've named him to you, but for legal reasons in public, I won't name him. But I know a lot of the people who attend the Jorvik Viking Festival who just cannot stand him at all, because he's so smug and arrogant in his wokeism, as these lefties do tend to be. And this is the whole point I'm making, Shawnae, is that, in essence, Odinism and paganism, full stop, is not about a political ideology. And this is what I say to people who are actually quite that way on the right and quite that way on the left, is that you are injecting a political ideology into a spiritual faith. And it's got absolutely nothing to do with that spiritual faith, because there is nothing in any of the surviving texts that tell pagans or Odinists like us that you've got to embrace this political agenda or that political agenda, because as far as we know, the gods are completely apolitical. And so therefore these fanatical extreme fringes on the left and the right, I don't tend to allow them into the Odinist order, because I know what they do. They just cause a war between each other, an ideological
Yeah,
war.
the infighting is insane. I mean, I'm sorry. I grew up in Minnesota, and I grew up around a lot of different kind of people, and I have people that I've known for my entire life. I still talk to him. I'm gonna talk to him. My niece, she's of mixed heritage. There's nothing I can do about that. She is my family, and I love her. And I'm not gonna let some far right wing, boots and bracers asshole tell me that I'm a fucking race traitor because I love my family or something like that. You know what I mean? Like,
absolutely.
everybody is a human being. Yes, there are some human beings I don't like more than others, but I don't have to allow that into my life. I don't have to absorb that. I don't need to mix my weird with theirs. They can have their weird shit over there. Don't tell me that I have to believe it. They can have their shit on the right and left. Like, but don't tell me that's like the only thing. Like, this is the right way. That's the right way. No, it's not. Whatever I want to fucking do is the right way for me.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not gonna mix my shit with yours. I've been doing a lot of just trying not to care about that. The political ideologies and shit like that anymore, because I can't do it. I can't do it. It's overwhelming. It takes a lot out of you. to
Yeah,
be
I
full
try.
bore into that stuff all the time, and all of it, a lot of it's just delusion and ego and
Yeah,
wanting to be right, and it's just not. You know what I mean?
it's about what's right for you, really.
Yeah.
That's what I think about it. I mean, it's like I said to you earlier before we started with the recording itself live, is that for a very long time now I've worshipped alone because of the shenanigans I've seen in groups, and I just I always worshipped in groups, very large groups in Nottingham. In actual fact, there's an awful lot of pagans in Nottingham. I think there's probably more pagans in Nottinghamshire um, than anywhere else in the country per head of population. I know there are more Odinists here, and but over the years I just got tired of all the shenanigans and the factions, etc. And some, people who really were intellectually challenging, for want of a better description. And I just set off. I said, well, I'm going to go and do the shaman thing, basically, and I'm going to worship alone. And most of the time, when I'm sat in the forest on my own, I just look around and think, wow, this is much better, because I can just worship the way I want to worship without somebody saying, oh, but did you know such and such wrote this book saying, you shouldn't worship like this and worship like that. Have you ever encountered Thomas Rousel of Survive the Jive?
I have heard of him, but I've not really paid attention to it.
Well, I've had a few encounters with him on social media, which is good for him. And he's the type who thinks he can read a book and then dictate to someone the way they worship. He runs an Odinist group, primarily Anglo-Saxon.
Wait, what is his last name?
Thomas Rousel. He
Oh,
runs a channel called Survive the Jive, which is quite successful. He's been around for a number of years on
yeah,
YouTube.
okay. I was just making
Um,
sure.
yeah, a lot of people think he's an authority. Well, he's not an authority to me, because at the end of the day, there's another thing that I decided to do many years ago. Can you remember the guy we had in the Odinist order years ago who thought the bookworm? We won't name him, but you remember him, who thought he knew everything
Oh,
because
yeah.
he'd read lots of books. As I tried to explain to him once, I said, you can read all the books you want. Yeah, I said, but all that will prove is that you've read a book and you've borrowed someone else's ideas. I said, how many books have you written yourself? How many books have you written yourself? What life have you led, to enable you to write a
To
book?
be an authority.
That's right, to be an authority.
That's
You're not
funny.
an
You sound like
authority.
Brian when you say that. He says that kind of stuff too.
But it is true, Shawnae. And the thing is, I very rarely, I mean, I do read books in a professional capacity because of the political work I do and also journalism. But in the context of Odinism, I very rarely read books because I used to read lots of books, and now I just take the view that, well, I know how to worship this faith. I know what's good for me. Nobody's going to tell me what's right and what's wrong. I remember Thomas Rousel trying to tell me about the difference between a tree being a villi and a V, the masculine and feminine energies. And I'm like, go away, boy, go away.
I have heard that before, and I I don't necessarily think he's right, but then again, I don't necessarily think he's wrong, because there is that balance in everything, the masculine and the feminine.
Absolutely.
Actually, in my kindred, we had an interesting discussion, because they had learned Odinism through prison. And
Yeah.
I looked at, and I'm just like, I'm sorry, but I'm not a prison crew member. I didn't learn that to survive in prison.
That's
I
right.
was given a book that I read, and I decided that I wanted more from it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and I'm not going to do the whole prison true man thing. We're not going from the man perspective. We need balance. I said, Odin's not the only deity, but that is the one that I'm most drawn to.
That's right.
And there are goddesses and this and that. I'm like, we need to look at it from a feminine perspective as well.
Of course, absolutely. I mean, funny you mentioned the prison aspect, because, I mean, as you know, Shawnae, in fact, we'll cover this for the viewers, because you remember we actually met for the first time on VK.com,
Yeah.
through the Odinist work there. And you know what legal situation I was in at that time. And I actually, the night before I was arrested, having been there unlawfully at large for over 2 years, I was sat by the River Thames outside Oxford, you know, the famous city of Oxford, education, all that business, the Oxford Spiring. And I actually said to you, describe the scenery of where I am right now. Remember, because we were doing that testing about parallel soul dreaming, which we've been doing for
Yeah.
a few weeks, and also remote viewing. And you described the scenery to my left perfectly, in actual fact. And then the next day, I was gone. You remember? And you wrote to my mother, and she passed the letter on to me in prison. I got it a few weeks later whilst I was on D Wing. And
Yeah.
so the reason why it's significant is because when you mentioned, you know, the Astrua, the AFA, etc., and people who've been in prison, well, here, I don't know what it's like in the States, but here in prison, you get treated very badly if you're a pagan, and particularly an Odinist. If somebody sends you a book, it's like someone, you know, Edred Thorson, the book Room Might. I had a friend,
Yeah.
an American guy in Brighton, in actual fact. He moved there because, you know, he married an English girl in California, and then they split up and he had to go over there to be near his children. And he had a friend called Tim down in Brighton who was separating from his wife. I spoke to them one day on the phone in my cell, and he said, "Would you like some books?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, sure I would, you know, but it's very difficult to get them, and I can't really afford all these books." So don't worry about it. He said, "I need to get rid of a lot of my money," he said, "to stop my wife from getting her hands on it." I said, "Really?" He said, "So I'll send you about £200 worth of books from Amazon." I said, "You don't have to do that, man." So he sent me about £220 worth of books from Amazon. Now, all of them got through, but they intercepted one, and I mean security. So security, in a sense, would be a little bit like your FBI, that type of thing.
Okay.
And I actually challenged them about it. I said, "Why have you intercepted this book, Room Might?" You know, "Oh, well, you see, now the thing is, it has all these icons and symbols in it, which we think are connected to the far right." Okay. I said, "Right, okay." I said, "So fair enough." I said, "Would you intercept a particular esoteric type of Bible coming in for a Christian, or a Buddhist text, for example, you know, or a different type of Quran to a Muslim?" I said, "You just would not do this, would you?" And this is the point I'm making. They gave me the book back a week later after they scanned it, checked every single page of it to make sure that it was acceptable for a prison community. This is prison we're talking about, you know,
Right.
you know. And the prison I was in, HMP Ramby in North Nottinghamshire, which is up on the South Yorkshire border, absolutely dreadful place. And it is really intensively cultural Marxist, you know. And they have all of these, they have this huge hall. It was the old dining hall, and they converted it into the equalities department, you know, DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusivity. Oh, yeah. Every type of crazy flag you could think of. I'm not joking. I used to look around and think, oh my goodness, honestly. And it was the best funded department in the entire prison, because
Oh, of
everywhere else,
course it was.
of course, yeah, political ideology. And these were the people who actually pursued the campaign of harassment against me, because, you know, the pagan minister, so called, because he had it in for me, because I basically upstaged him quite a few times in group sessions, because he used to talk the biggest pile of crap, quite frankly, to the other prisoners who didn't know, and I'd pull him up on it and correct it, and he hated it. And so we had a few verbal encounters, and after that he went and reported me to security, who then brought in counter-terrorism. And so I got a visit from a counter-terrorism officer who challenged me about an imaginary death curse on the unborn child of my former partner, who had, in actual fact, had a hysterectomy several years before I met her. And because we're pagans, not Christians, we don't have immaculate conception, you see. And that's an enormous leap of faith anyway. Immaculate conception is just nonsense, in my opinion. And of course, eventually, cut a long story short, they backed down. But for months, they impeded my progress. simply on the ground, on political and religious grounds. And this is how they behave here, because there is no freedom of expression in this country, Shawnae. We don't have the First Amendment.
Here, I think that's probably the only thing that saves the prisons from being like that. The prisons here mostly everybody has their own groups. There's I think there's the Peckerwoods and the Aryan Cowboys, and you have your Christian nationalists in there, and then you have your Odinists, and your Mexican gangs and your black gangs and whatever. I think that's how it is. But they all intertrade with each other and do whatever. And you know what I mean? They're not, I don't know. I've never been to prison. I'm only going based off of people that I know that have been to prison and what they tell me.
Well, the funny thing is, I'll share an anecdote with you. I'm sure you've seen the film American History X.
Oh, yes.
So I was actually after that prison, after I had all these legal battles with them, it's coming towards the end of my sentence. I was in for what we call hurty words. In other words, freedom of expression. In the States, it was just freedom of expression. That doesn't exist here. Okay. You have the First Amendment. No such thing exists in this country. What we have here is an almost Soviet-style tyranny. And so I was coming towards the end of that sentence, and so I got shipped to what's called an open prison. So it's a decategorization, and it's to prepare you for release into the community, for you to be rehabilitated. And I actually sent a letter to one officer when I was at the previous prison. I said, well, let's say hypothetically I did need to be rehabilitated. How would this prison ever be able to do that when it has never succeeded in rehabilitating anyone? And quite apart from which fact, I said, I'm a blogger. I said, why does a blogger need to be rehabilitated? And what process of rehabilitation do you have for bloggers? Of course, they threw me off the announce wing just for sending that letter. But when I got to this other prison, it was quite amusing, actually, because the Outlaws MC?
Oh, yeah.
The motorbike gang? Or motorcycle club. So the Outlaws MC, which is international, it's all over the States as well. And so they've got this chapter. And part of their chapter was in HMP Sudbury in Derbyshire. And because they'd been involved in a dispute over, some business arrangements that had gone wrong. And they'd got sent to prison for it. And I met them there. They were in the adjoining cells. And because it's an open cell, you can just open the door whenever you want to. There's no toilets in it. You have to go to a communal block. And so there was a scene I think it was about 10 days before I got released. And there's this guy, I won't name him, he's one of the top people in the Outlaws MC in the West Midlands, which is the neighboring region to us. And he was stood there talking to a black guy, and he's got swastikas tattooed all over his legs, big tattoo of Adolf Hitler on his shoulder, and the Gefalb eagle, the golden eagle clutching the swastika on the other chest. I just stood there looking at them talking, and I thought, this really is just like a scene from American History X. I actually thought I was in American History X, and I'm like, here's this guy covered in swastika tattoos with an Adolf Hitler, and there's this black guy doing a business deal with him, and they pretty much all knew each other anyway from the West Midlands, basically, because Birmingham is like the second largest city in Britain, and it's got some very serious problems, and a lot of those serious problems were actually in that prison. And so, yeah, I thinking back on it, it's one of those moments where you have to pinch yourself, and it's like, is this happening? I've seen this in a film.
I have a similar story of that. I had a neighbor girl, and she liked her African American boys.
Yeah.
And this guy comes over, and she's like, "Oh, I want you to meet him," or whatever. And he had a Pulp Fiction shirt on, and immediately I was like, "Okay, he might be okay, dude." And then as we're sitting there talking, I find out, ironically enough, his birthday is 420. And
Yeah.
then he starts April 20th. Happens to be Hitler's birthday and my grandmother's.
Yeah.
But and then he started talking about Hitler and telling
Yeah.
me all kinds of things about World War II and this and that, and how Hitler may have not been such a bad guy. And,
Yeah.
he
You counted
telling
it.
me that, like, he wanted to, he's like, I think everybody should have nationalism. He goes, we should all have it for, like, he goes, it's different for us to be in America versus
Mm.
like in Europe or wherever else,
Yeah, of course.
because we
Yeah.
are such a melting
Yeah.
pot. He goes, but I think we
Mm.
all need that. Like, that's
Yeah.
something that is important, like our identity. And I just looked at it. I'm
Yeah.
like, who is this person? And how did they learn? A majority of the African Americans I've ever talked to about this stuff were in the military.
Of course. Yeah.
So I feel like they have a better understanding of some of the things like
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
it
There was
was
a guy
very
I could see.
strange.
Yeah, it is. I know totally because I empathise there. Because when I was in HMP Ramby, I was on House Block 5, which was an open wing, and there was a black guy there from Derby, a city about 15 miles away from me, and he used to be addicted to the History Channel, and then it's what it became after that. I can't remember what it was called after that. And he'd come into my cell and he'd say, "Did you watch it last night, Simon?" And I was like, "What?" The documentary on the History Channel about Hitler. I was like, no. And then he'd come in another time. Did you watch that one last night about the Third Reich? I said, no, I didn't, Rick. I said, I actually got my head down, went to sleep fairly early. Because when I was in prison, my policy was go to work all day, go to sleep early, the time passes quickly.
Yeah.
Get it done, get it out of the way quickly as possible. And I actually went into his cell one day and I said to him, I said, Rick, I said, I've come to the conclusion, I said, that you were a Nazi in a previous life. And I was expecting him to be quite upset. And he said, no. He says, I probably was, in actual fact, to tell you the truth. He says, because all I ever do is watch programs about Hitler and the Third Reich. And this guy's black, and most of the guys are white guys.
There are some things, and I'm not going to lie, there's some very strong German ancestry in my line. And I've always felt like History Channel, that World War II specifically, I always felt a very strong pull towards, and I could never describe it. And then once I got into paganism and started finding like things like VK and Telegram and in the channels where you can find certain things like the greatest story never told, and then what was that, Europa, the last battle,
Yeah, I've seen
and
it. Yeah.
those, when I watched those, I felt like I felt like that was something more normal than the things that I had watched on TV or been taught in school. It made more sense than some of the things we were told. But I felt just this very deep knowing, like, I think I was a part of that world at some point. I don't know if I was a man or a woman or whatever, but definitely I feel like in a past life, as far back as you can go, that's where my roots are from.
You remember when we were first met years ago on VK.com, and I was telling you about my ex-partner, Elizabeth. She was she told me, she was into, not paganism as such. She classed herself as a spiritualist. But, in my opinion, she was actually a Christian spiritualist. But she used to say to me, she said, now she said, you were a senior officer in the SS in World War II. But by the end of 1943, you came to your senses. I said, well, what do you mean I came to my senses by the end of 1943? I said, everybody in the German military knew by the end of 1943 the war was only going one way, defeat. I said, it was not a case of anybody would have come to the senses. It was just, after they lost the Battle of the Kursk on the Russian front, it was over. But no, it's funny because I won't say it live on air, Shawnae, for obvious reasons, but one of our cousins, we have a genetic connection through shared ancestry. And one of our cousins, I'll introduce you to another time. We've not met her yet. I'll hook you up with her. Well, she has got a very definite Third Reich connection. Very senior as well, right up at the top. So yeah, I mean, look, I've always believed in scientists now start to talk quite a bit about genetic race memories. In other words, what's passed down through your DNA. It's like, I remember years ago being in Sherwood Forest, which is not too far away, to my right-hand side in actual fact. And it was winter, and we used to get really heavy winters here at that time before the seasons went crazy. And I was like about 15. I went there with a flask, with some warm tea in and some food. And I built myself a little snow den and just watched the red deer feasting off the low-hanging tree branches, evergreen trees. And I looked around and I thought, I always used to prefer going into that part of the forest that was evergreens, like primarily Scots pine and also Corsican pine and occasionally spruce trees. And then years later, I thought to myself, well, it made sense because I thought, well, that's the Viking, the Scandinavian ancestry coming out, because they had mostly, well, they did have deciduous trees, obviously, but the evergreen trees played a great part in actual fact in their natural environment. And it's the same thing with what you just explained there about you feeling that connection to Germany in World War II. It's just a genetic race memory.
Also, Poland. Do you know anything about Pomerania?
Yeah, a little, not too much. Wasn't it a German province at one time, Pomerania? Because there was a Pomeranian.
Yeah, I think it was like, what did they call it? That area was Prussia.
Yeah, Prussia. Yeah, absolutely, Prussia. Absolutely. Yeah, the Prussian officer class, which was basically like our upper class here. Yeah, go on.
But Pomerania, like I've including German family members, actual like ones in recent years, you can trace my lines back all the way to Pomerania, which is ironic because like my grandmother and my biological grandfather, both of their family lines were in the same place at the same time. They migrated roughly from the same place to this, and I was thinking about it. Also, Brian, my boyfriend, I can trace his family back to that same area in Pomerania.
Yeah.
Like, and I've always felt something strong to that area, and that I don't know if it's I don't know much about Slavic deities at all, really, but I feel like what am I trying to say? I kind of went blank. I'm sorry.
You do a full connection to it.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I feel like I do to that area as well, but they were also Germanic tribes.
Yeah, of course.
In that area
it's
that
like
have broken off.
Some of our cousins over there in the States, because we both done these, these DNA tests and my true ancestry, etc. And, I've been in contact with quite a lot of the American side of the family. And a lot of them want to come back here to England. And I'm like, well, why on earth would you want to come and live in England? It's
not right now.
It's a dictatorship. No, it's a dictatorship. Oh yeah, but it's our homeland, our motherland, etc. And I was like, yeah, sure, I understand that entirely. But they've got that same sort of genetic connection and yearning for England, like what you've got with that Pomeranian thing. And then, of course, you told me years ago about your surname and your connection to the Normans, who were originally Danish Vikings. converted to Christianity purely for pragmatic reasons. I don't think they ever really were sincere
With
about it, because
everything like in my lines, it all kinds of comes. It comes from all places, and then it's like meets in one spot. So in Sweden, we have the, what do they call them? Sphere or Svar. They're descendants of Freyr. And then the Danes, they say that the Pomeranians had something, they ended up being like the remaining pagans or whatever. What is that place? So not Jorvik. Oh, it was like a mash of a bunch of pagans that were like left over and went and made like this little island that nobody could find.
Oh, I know what you mean. Yeah, the Jomsvikinger.
There you go. Yes, descendants of those. So like when you look at that, like, and they're all all from different places, but they all end up inevitably, it all ends up coming full circle. Do you
absolutely.
understand what I mean?
Yeah. I do, definitely, because I remember on mytrueancestry.com, some new data became available, and it showed direct line ancestry on my part to two skeletal remains from the Jomsvikinger. And I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense. And of course, the Swedes with the Ingvar, which means they were known as the sons and daughters of Ingvay, and that's in essence what the English are. England or Engeland, as they still pronounce it. I mean, it used to be called Engeland, and the Danes still call it Engeland to this day. And so, yeah, basically, the English, they're the sons and daughters of Ingvay, land of the Angles, basically, and they're all northern Germanic tribes. And so, I mean, even Pomerania, in essence, it's borderline northern Germanic, Central European. But in truth, you can never escape.
This is a squirrel, kind of. How do you feel about Russia? Okay, so like with Russia and Poland and those areas, Lithuania, Slovakia, those types of places, they worship in tandem. They're not all necessarily Christians, they're not all necessarily pagans, but they worship the old ways and the new. How do you feel about that?
Well, my attitude is it's entirely up to them, Shawnae, but I think we have to be very careful with what we say here on YouTube, because the algorithm doesn't like any heavy criticism of Ukraine, you see. So
I didn't say nothing about them.
No, I'm just saying I have to be careful in particular, because I'm going to say something
sorry.
now about,
I didn't think about that.
Yeah, the Ukraine-Russia war. So I remember back to the Battle of Bakhmut, which happened strategically. Many people argued it needn't have happened, but the vast majority of people on both sides who fought the Battle of Bakhmut, which was by far the most vicious battle of the war, were pagans on both sides. Russian pagans and Ukrainian and other European pagans and NATO officers on the other side.
The last stand for paganism. Like basically when all the conversions happened, that was the last place to truly be converted. Like it was the last pagan land. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They didn't give in so easily.
The country that we know today as Ukraine, irrespective of how it was created, originally it grew out of the Runic dynasty from southern Sweden. And prior to that, in Russia, you had the Ingvay, which is my great-grandmother's people from southern Sweden. And Ingvar means basically sons and daughters of Ingvay, and they believe they were directly descended from the Vanir gods, basically. And so Russia's very first army, this is their own history, their own account of it, was the Varangian Guard, Vikinger, southern Swedes, And the very first army on the land of what
have connection to.
is the Rurics, and so the Rurics and the Ingvay had a great deal of rivalry, and the Ruric dynasty was particularly ruthless in getting rid of its own people within its own family in power struggles. And so, in truth, look, I mean, I mentioned him in a previous video tonight. Patriarch Kirill, which is like the Archbishop of Russia, in the Orthodox Church, he's got quite a hold over Putin in terms of influencing matters. And he asked Putin to put religious officers in every battalion of the Russian military to curtail the rise of paganism. But the oddest thing was, I think it was about 4 months ago, something like that, Patrick Lancaster, an American journalist, embedded on the Russian side, covering the war from their point of view. He met, it was in the Kursk salient, where the Ukrainians were being expelled after their failed invasion of Russia. And this this Orthodox priest had got 3 Velcro patches written in Anglo-Saxon Futhark runes, and I studied them, and I was like, wow, this is bizarre. And yet I've seen it on even the suicide drone squads and also main battle tanks. They have the spear of Odin painted on them, and the Ukrainians also have a huge amount of pagan iconography in their military units and targeting systems, and so do the Russians. And I'm like, it's odd because the Ukrainians tend to have the Elder Futhark, Central German, but the Russians tend to have the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, which is even more bizarre to me, because whilst the vast majority of people here in England wouldn't understand the Anglo-Saxon Futhark if they tripped over it, it's actually fairly,
I don't. I'm not very good with it at all, to be honest.
Well, it's to be honest, Shawnae, the Anglo-Saxon Futhark is actually more complicated, and it all comes from dialectical differences. So as tribes move around, their accent and dialect changes, etc. And so the extended the Runic alphabet, the Futhark, and likewise with the the Scandinavian ones, they obviously shortened the Futhark because of their dialect, and so over here they expanded it. And I actually find it's probably a little bit more complex for divination, but in terms of writing and expressing ideas, it's a little bit more colourful, but it's actually far more expressive than the younger Futhark, for example, which is very abrupt and guttural, which is what Icelandic is to this day, in actual fact.
Yeah.
So that fits entirely. But if you ask me, which one do I prefer overall? I'd say it probably would be the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, and that's not because I'm born in England. It's just because having used all the Futharks, that's the one I prefer most, because it is just so much more graphic, you see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so this is the aspect of Odinism. Is like, why did I become an Odinist? Well, in essence, at school, I was always arguing with teachers on political grounds, and so I got excluded from certain lessons. And I thought, well, I got a part-time job, and the money I earned from this part-time job, working a couple of days a week, and in the evenings after school, I joined a book club. And one of the books I bought was Blood and Soil by Anna Bramwell. And in there, I saw the runes for the very first time when I was 15 years old, the Elder Futhark. And it just electrified me, because it was exactly at the time I was definitely rejecting Christianity. But I realized it had nothing for me whatsoever, didn't appeal to me, wasn't my type of thing, and actually made me, being in a church just made my skin crawl, quite frankly. And so, but in truth, it wasn't until many years later, well, I say many years later, a few years later, when I actually was in the British National Party and I met John Peacock, that because he was running an Odinist group there, and I'd say probably half the people in the BNP were Odinists themselves, particularly in the direct action units who were fighting the far left. And in essence, that's where my process turning to Odinism began. And you've explained how yours began. And I think in this stream that we've done here, I hope we've helped people to understand how we both turned to Odinism and why we did it. Because a lot of people have said to me, how do we get involved with Odinism? And that was my idea behind making this stream. And obviously we can do other streams at another time, but I've waffled enough. So you close, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. You close with what you need to say.
Oh, I
How
I
about the
don't.
Mariana Society?
I got to go to an event with them recently in South Dakota that was pretty great. I don't know that. What is it? Cityism? How do you say that?
Yeah, you've got it right. Yeah. Yeah, you got it
I
right.
don't know that that's the right thing for me because again, I don't like being told what I should believe. You know, and that is what it is. They're all really great people and um the rituals were very powerful. I feel like there was another incident where I seen Odin in the fire. My daughter did. She told me at the event she found Odin 3 times that weekend. She found
Wonderful.
him she found him once. It's like a little figurine, a wooden figurine. There was a scavenger hunt. She said she found him again in the fire
Just there behind me.
at the ritual. Oh yeah. Yeah, and she found
you
him in the
see?
fire at the ritual, and then again there was a boy named Odin there.
Wow, that's
And
great.
and that just really, I had dreams for a couple of months leading up until going to that event, seeing these people's faces and our interactions down to the ritual, everyone dressed in red and walking down the hill and the sun wheel on fire, and like it was all very spiritual. I didn't
Powerful.
do too much talking about books and whatever and what we think is right and wrong. I was just there, you know what I mean,
Yeah,
enjoying the weekend and the hospitality and all of that. And they didn't seem weird to me, like they were gonna tell me they were ordained and I need to listen to them. I actually had a woman in the AFA tell me that, and I basically told her to get
oh
fucked.
wow, yeah,
But
absolutely. She probably did.
yeah, she said ordained. I said, by who? The fucking Asa Pope? Fuck you. You're not going to tell me what to think. I don't give a
Exactly.
shit. Who gave you a title? I'm not going to believe that
Yeah,
if I don't feel it's right. And I'm
yeah,
a lot like
that's
that
true.
with a lot of people.
Yeah, there's quite a few people like that here. I mean, if you can remember the Odinist order years ago, who was that fruitcake that came along and claimed that he was it what was he the living incarnation of Frey he claimed to be? Can you remember him?
Yeah.
And
I
he was a
don't
nutcase.
remember what his name is.
I know. I don't remember his name, but he believed he was a living incarnation of Frey. And the thing is, in every spiritual faith, in every religion, you'll always get these fruitcakes. And the essence of surviving it is to exclude them, to ostracize them and leave them to their own community of demagogues and demigods, basically. But listen, Shawnae, I've got to wind it down now because we've only got an hour. But I just want to say to people that if they want to learn more about Odinism, they can come over and meet you at the Odinist Order on Facebook. All they have to do is search for the Odinist Order, and then they can hook up with you and learn more that way. And thank you for appearing on the Daily Agenda. And I hope people are much clearer now, and we'll tune in again another time. Take care,
Awesome.
Shawnae.
Thank you. Thanks
See
for
you.
having
Bye-bye.
me.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.